my after-dinner speaker, my first guest of the week, because it's Tuesday, the day after Easter Monday, Brian Easton, our economist. Kia ora, Brian.
Kia ora, Brian.
Welcome back to Nights. You've chosen a big one, but I'm glad you have. Housing. If you go down the street and ask people, is there a problem with housing? I think a lot of people would say yes. It might just be that they've read about it in the news or heard it on the radio or watched it on television, but I think generally people think that there's a bit of an issue at the moment. The government made a big announcement the other day. It claimed it was putting $3.8 billion into funding the problem, or at least funding solutions to the problem. We hope they're not actually funding the problem further. Can we begin by me asking you to summarise what the government has done? They've announced that they're going to build a bit more, but they're also changing some of the rules around taxation, aren't they?
There are two things going on. On the one hand, we have a speculative bubble, and the government has tried to deal with that by changing essentially tax rules, and that's the bright line test, so you can't speculate, quickly turn over houses, and also it's, in a sense, because there's no capital gains tax, it has introduced it's changed allowing people to to offset their second housing expenses, the interest on their second housing expenses. So they've got that problem. The other problem, we don't have enough houses.
Right.
And indeed, we also have people who can't get into houses.
Which is the bigger problem, Brian?
The
lack of housing?
I don't know.
Right.
My view is the speculative boom is easier to solve. You can't change the basic stock of housing very fast.
No, it takes a while to build houses, doesn't it?
Well, you build an extra 10,000 houses, you've added 1% to the housing stock. Next, that's population is increasing 1 or 2% per annum. So you really and so it's a long-term strategy, and we've lost control of that. But they have attempted, as I say, to get rid of this speculative boom.
So there are a couple of things. Is that the Bright Line test, it's been stretched out to, 10 years? So that means if a second home, not the home I might live in, the family home, as it seems to be called, the family home is a sacred animal, some second home, if I buy it and then sell it less than 10 years later, if there's any capital gain on that, will I have to pay tax on that? My
understanding is yes.
What's the tax rate for that? Do you know?
They treat it as income.
Right.
So you'll be paying income tax on it.
Okay. So it just depends on how much you earned that year in
terms
of
income.
Can I
say that there was a Bright Line test earlier? It was first introduced by the national government.
Yes, I remember them introducing it.
Right. But also there was also ways that capital gains tax on property speculators. If your job was turning over houses, flipping houses, the IRD deemed that was your job and they charged you a capital gains tax. But this is a much wider thing, and clearly it is intended to discourage people from buying a house and then selling it in 6 years' time.
And then the loophole, if say I buy another property and I borrow money in order to buy it, then it allows me, I used to be able, until this announcement from the government, I used to be able to write off the interest I paid on borrowing that as on my tax.
Well, what happened was that you would rent the house out.
Yep.
And from the rental revenue you got, you could deduct insurance, property and other landlord's cost, and the interest that you were paying on the debt.
Right.
Now, the government has said that no longer will they allow you to deduct the interest.
And I've heard a few landlords saying, well, I'm just going to claw that money I'm losing back in rent, right?
Well, you'd expect them to say that, wouldn't you?
Yes, you would. Yes. But isn't it a seller's market at the moment?
For rental? I'm not sure about that.
There are a lot of people talking about how expensive it is to get a rental property.
That's a different issue. Yeah, but whether you can, let me give you one example. Here in Wellington, we've had a lot of Asian students, and the Asian students fill up rental accommodation, or they take over the halls and the students fill up rental accommodation. Now, they're not around at the moment. And this year is the first year in my memory that we didn't have a flat panic in January and February looking for rental for students. So the pressures are there and they're not there. In many ways, the pressure at the moment, because of the restriction on mobility across the border, is New Zealanders coming home. And generally, yes, New Zealanders coming home have got cash and want to buy a house.
You make a really good point there, Brian, and this is something just in general in terms of watching the world. Sometimes it's the noise that isn't made that's interesting. And you're right, that's been an annual story. Student renters can't find a flat.
Yep.
We didn't have that story this year. You're right.
Yeah.
Not as much anyway.
Certainly not.
Yeah, so sometimes it's the bit that's quiet. It's interesting.
And you do get a lot of empty barrels making a lot of sound. I mean to say, landlords say they're going to put up the price. I think a lot more of them will be trying to sell their houses, actually.
If this, as you say, it's a speculative, do you think, is it possible to say, really, I know your answer already, in terms of whether this will reduce the speculation. That's obviously what the government wants to achieve sooner, because it's going to take a long time to build enough houses to make a difference in the supply, isn't it?
Yep.
So you think the speculation might ease off?
I'm guessing the speculation will ease off, but the consequences we don't know about. And you mentioned one: what will happen to rents? Will landlords sell houses into the market?
In terms of speculation, we have had very low interest rates. The cost of borrowing is very low at the moment. Isn't that also a source of, if I own several properties already, isn't it actually very easy for me to borrow more money and just buy more properties, especially with the price going up? There'd seem a big incentive to do that.
One way of thinking about the change in interest rate deductibility, it's added 2 or 3 percentage points of interest to landlords. And so when they were borrowing, say, at 4%, now they're borrowing more like 6%.
Right.
And so it's a change. You can think of that as the government having put a wedge in between interest rates for family homes and interest rates for other homes.
Then there's the whole issue of housing supply. And are we, to some extent, Brian, reaping decisions that have been made for quite a few decades not to invest in social housing as much as we were?
I think one of the difficulties has been that we have cut back on spending on social housing, and we've just said it will be supplied by the private market. And then the government has sort of backed out and waved its hands and left things behind.
And now the private market in the form of motels is supplying a lot of emergency housing, isn't it?
Well, exactly. The government, in a sense, has said that policy, which started in the early 90s, has failed, and we're going to have to provide social housing temporarily. As you say, it will be motels. Of course, once the tourist boom gets underway, they may have a bit of a challenge there.
Yes, they may well. I mean, that's going to be one of the challenges for moteliers and the people in those motels at the moment, if suddenly there are a lot of Australians wanting to come on holiday again.
Yes. I was struck that the government announcement today about the bubble with Australia, they've actually said that some of the quarantine hotels they're going to put back into the market, abandon using them for guests, and that reflects that the Australians don't have to go into them, but it also says that the Australians will be going into them as tourists rather than quarantine. Be a better feeling for it.
Why do New Zealanders invest in property? Because we do, don't we, Brian?
Most New Zealand, there's a whole history which goes back actually into the 19th century. I guess Wakefield said, secure the land. And that history goes on to people who had good jobs in the cities in the 19th century, abandoning good jobs and going into actually subsistence farming because they had the land, they had the house on the land. Now, the next step on that is that we begin to run out of land. So we begin to fund, it was the government that funded it, a big housing boom straight after the First World War. And then the Labour government did that during the Second World War. So our history is of property investment. The other side to it is the alternatives have not been very great. We had a share market crash in the early 60s. We had a share market crash.
Did we, in the early 60s?
Yes. Unit trusts sort of were set up with the thing of the day and they collapsed. Then we had another one in 73. We had another one in 87. Share markets are volatile. That's why you get a higher rate of return. But each one discourages people from investing in it. I was struck that during Rogernomics, some selling off of public assets, people were given the money as shares from the public asset, and they didn't invest it. They actually sold it and bought themselves a new fridge or something.
Well, I remember that.
Yeah.
If you were you have a bill on a certain electricity supplier, and you got this windfall, and a lot of us just, I'm taking the money.
In fact,
I'm not taking the bag.
There were people sort of lined out in queues outside shops saying, we'll take the shares from you. So we don't have a culture of a share market. We have a very small, thin share market.
What might persuade New Zealanders, because we invest, those with money, because, we're just talking about people who've got money to invest, disposable income, which is not the whole country. In fact, it's not even half the country, is it?
It's older people.
Yeah. If that's an issue, then what else could they possibly invest in if it's not the share market? Or do we need to make them try again?
They could go mad and invest in cryptocurrencies and dud finance companies and so on. We've been all that, but they will do that. I think myself, one possibility is they may end up having very attractive deals in trading bank shares, because it looks as though some of the trading banks will be issuing shares in their New Zealand businesses. And those are reasonably good propositions. The trading banks are profitable and they are reasonably secure. So you might start doing it. The other place actually where New Zealanders hold a lot of shares is in KiwiSaver. If you've got a KiwiSaver account, it's probably some of it is invested in shares. And probably actually some of it is invested in foreign shares.
Is there a danger that that we actually have a bit of a bubble in our housing prices that might burst?
I've always taken the view that housing prices could fall by up to 10%, but at a certain point that will stop. And the reason is this, that these housing prices is partly stoked by people turning over their family homes. And once housing prices start to fall, they will stop selling their family homes and upgrading, and that will put a floor under the market. Now, I could be wrong.
Well, I thought that happened a bit in 2008.
Yes.
People they just didn't sell. They sat on it.
Yep.
Yeah. What about the time it might take for us to start to make a difference in terms of housing supply, particularly social housing? I mean, has the government, in what the government announced, your observation, Brian, do you think that the government is serious about providing us with a significant increase in the amount of social housing over the next decade?
I think it's desperate to do that, but the difficulty is this. If you build an extra 10,000 houses, which is a big extra, that adds 1% to the housing stock.
As you said,
so
yes.
So the difficulty then is that it's actually a very slow process to build more houses.
But as I said, is it a slow process that got us here in the first place? We've done since the 1990s.
Do that, yeah. In a way, you're arguing that we've got almost 30 years of backlog. It's not quite that bad. And we won't find easy to catch up. Pardon me.
Go ahead. While you have a cough, Brian, I've got another question. I think we can just squeeze this in. Are there alternative ways of ownership, modes of ownership, that perhaps could allow people to purchase homes? At the moment, as single economic units or family units they can't afford. Is there a future for that?
I think we'll look for that, and there are housing associations that help. Remember Mike Moore's Sweat Equity, which you bought a rundown house and you rebuilt it yourself. So I think that it has. I think they'll make a contribution, but not a major contribution. The real issue is just to build enough houses.
Brian, thank you very much for joining us again. And that's Brian now grabbing a glass of water that arrived just in time. Yes, he's still alive. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for coming in. That's Brian Easton, our economist. Kia ora, Brian. He'll be back with more discussions on economics in about 2.5 months.